The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 came on the heels of a lot of changes in the 1930s. So the Progressive Era really laid the groundwork for this kind of social reform and political reform. The Indian Reorganization Act was intended to reverse some of the really harmful effects of the Dawes Act by ending allotment as a practice and by returning some of the land that had been unrightfully, unjustly taken away because of that parceling process. The other seemingly positive change that the Indian Reorganization Act implemented was the so-called return to self-government on a tribal basis. What that meant was that tribes were told that they needed to form a tribal council, adopt a constitution, and basically develop a governance structure that is modeled on the federal government structure. So while they were saying we're turning over government into your hands, it was a model that was not from the traditions of governance within the tribal nation itself. And it was still a model of government that ultimately had to answer to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So one of the things we see with Indian reorganization is that there's a very narrow idea of what constitutes self-government. And we also see a real mixed bag in some of the reforms. There are definitely some pros in terms of ending allotment, for example, and recognizing that self-government is valid, but the cons are in what that would actually look like and how that would play out in lived reality. So kind of getting ahead of myself with the slides here, but the other thing that is a pro is ending abusive boarding school practices. One of the things we could see is that historically, prior to a lot of the reforms that Collier implemented, there was a lot of overt abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse in boarding schools, and that this was a systemic practice in many cases. And the Indian Reorganization Act recognized the problematic nature of this. A lot of so-called muckraker journalists were exposing the terrible conditions in a lot of these schools, and there was quite a bit of pressure to have more humane schooling experiences for American Indians. However, putting new policies in place for the boarding schools didn't necessarily mean that the abuse itself ended or that the fundamental goal of these institutions changed. So a lot of other problems still continued, such as a lack of community control over the schooling of their children, big gaps in funding, and really problematic curriculum that was intended to assimilate students and teach them not to adhere to the culture or ways of knowing from their community. So in terms of ending allotment, also, while some of the land was returned, most of it was not, and the damage was already done. The other thing is the method of including culture in schools during this time was not really based on indigenous ways of knowing or of approaching content knowledge in a way that would be deemed appropriate within that tribal nation. Instead, it was more like a factual content coverage. So some of the difference would be, if you're going to approach some of these cultural ideas, but you're going to do it with a worksheet perspective, that really undermines the whole purpose of including that idea in the first place. And then, one of the other cons is that idea of setting up schooling and strengthening it still often had an industrial or vocational education focus. And so from that standpoint, setting people up to have the kind of education that would lead to self-determination in a really good way wasn't quite there. So Collier and the Indian Reorganization Act, or IRA, definitely affirmed this idea of tribal culture or self-government, but not necessarily sovereignty in the sense that sovereignty means being able to decide to opt out of some of these assimilating processes, or the ability to just be left alone. Some of the constraints also were because of the differences in interests and purposes between the federal and tribal governments. And there's a lot of patronizing sentiment embedded in these policies, especially in terms of portraying tribal nations as kind of students under the leadership of the federal government, or as people who are not fit to lead their own lives, or as people who are dependent rather than adult and fit to make their own decisions. So when we understand all of the formal educational pressures that were facing tribal nations, it's important to recognize that boarding schools were not filling an absence. In other words, it's not true that tribal nations had no system of schooling until boarding schools. It's just that their system of schooling did not look the way that boarding schools looked, or the way common schools looked. So again, when we look at liberal ideology, one of the things that seeing the world in this way does is it teaches us a very narrow way of understanding what constitutes education and what constitutes the ability to self-govern. Right? But when you consider indigenous knowledge systems and these four different parts, we can see this idea of what do you value? That ties into how you live in the world, or how you act. And that ties into how you know things and how you understand them. And that ties into how you teach those things and how you learn them. All of these things are very much related, and they inform one another in a very complex way when you're talking about a knowledge system. So with indigenous knowledge systems also, we're understanding it from a holistic perspective. This idea that a student is not just the intellectual part. They're also a spiritual person. They're an emotional entity, and an entity with a physical being. And you have to take care of all of these different areas in order to fully strengthen and support that person. So when you're considering the characteristics of an indigenous knowledge system, of an indigenous way of educating someone, we have to understand that all of these areas are being addressed. And that a lot of knowledge, is considered contextual. Whereas in liberalism, quite often the argument is that it's a universal or generalizable truth. And this is saying, no, you have to put it in context. The next one is intellect and moral values are not separate, whereas a lot of liberalism really encourages that separation. It also recognizes knowledge as a living process, that the way you are in the world brings you new experiences, which brings you new information, which changes how you are in the world, and you initiate an ongoing cycle. The other idea is that knowledge has a purpose. You don't just find something out because you can. You have a responsibility and to use that knowledge in a good way. And so you should really treat that knowledge with respect and understand the power behind it and not treat it lightly. The other part is recognizing that knowledge is relational and it requires reciprocity. You're not just there to kind of take things like a commodity and consume it. You're there to connect and deeply relate and then figure out what to do with this information. So, as we kind of keep going through here and look a little bit more deeply at what these characteristics mean, one of the most important things to understand is that moral aspect to this knowledge. The idea that as you're developing your intellect, you're developing your ethics. You're developing your ability to relate to other people in a responsible and ethical way. And from this perspective, I can tell what you know by how you act. If you are behaving in ways that are disrespectful, or in ways where you're trying to hold power over others or harm others, I can tell that you are not a wise person from this perspective. Also, this idea of responsibility implies that You have to know ahead of time what you're going to use this knowledge for and what the likely outcomes or consequences of that are going to be. And think about it ahead of time. Don't just do it because you can. Weigh the outcomes and then make a responsible decision. And this relationship, this connection, is kind of the central component of this knowledge, that there isn't a separation, a clean break, the way that a lot of liberal thinking would lead us to believe. Okay? And so the other part of this is this idea of relationships as active and as ongoing. Relationships that require your attention, maintenance, and continuity. And most of all, they require reciprocity. So when we understand all of this, one of the things we can see immediately is that indigenous knowledge systems are very much at odds with a liberal knowledge system or view of the world, and that there are real implications for different ways of behaving, different ways of operating an economy, different ways of relating to the land, and different ways of educating your youth that are all tied to this perspective. And so once we start to recognize the different ideologies that are at play, as well as the different interests that are involved, that sets us up to have a better understanding of why boarding schools are such a hot point in this education, and why the stakes were so high for figuring out how exactly American Indian youth were going to be educated on, and on whose terms.